They said he was too weak to work a farm, too thin to lift hay, too frail to survive a Kansas winter. But when the tornado came and the barn collapsed on top of her, Silas Crane, the mail-order husband everyone had mocked, crawled through hell itself to pull her out. This is the story of a man whose strength couldn't be measured in muscle, only in devotion. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through butter, and Martha Ellison felt her stomach twist into knots she didn't know existed. She stood on the wooden platform of Red Hollow Station, one hand clutching the telegram that had arrived 6 weeks prior, the other smoothing down the front of her best Sunday dress, though it was only Thursday, and the dress had seen better Sundays. Around her, the small crowd of townspeople pretended not to stare, but Martha could feel their eyes on her back, could hear the whispers that rustled through them like wind through dry corn stalks. "Poor thing," Mrs. Henderson murmured to her daughter, not quite quietly enough. "Ordering a husband through the post like a catalog item. What's this world coming to?" "Desperate times," someone else replied, and Martha's cheeks burned. She wasn't desperate. She was practical. There was a difference, though she'd be hard-pressed to explain it to anyone in Red Hollow who hadn't walked a mile in her worn boots. At 28 years old, Martha had already buried her parents, raised her younger brother Samuel from age 10, and kept their small farm running through drought, debt, and the kind of loneliness that settled into your bones like winter cold. The farm needed a man's hands, Samuel needed a father figure, and Martha needed someone to share the load before it crushed her entirely. So she'd done what any sensible woman in her position would do. She'd answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. "Gentleman seeks honest partnership with woman of good character. Not wealthy, but educated and willing to work. Prefer correspondence before commitment." They'd exchanged 7 letters over 3 months. Silas Crane wrote with a careful, elegant hand, the kind that suggested education and thoughtfulness. He'd been honest about his circumstances. A schoolteacher from Ohio who'd lost his position when the school closed, no family to speak of, looking for a fresh start in the territories. He'd asked about her favorite books, her thoughts on politics, whether she believed in God or just in making it through each day. He'd made her laugh with stories about his students' antics and moved her with his quiet admission that he was tired of being alone. Not once had he mentioned that he was built like a scarecrow in a windstorm. The train hissed to a stop in a great cloud of steam and coal smoke. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd sent him a photograph, the one taken at the county fair 3 years ago, where the photographer had caught her in a rare moment of laughter. He'd sent one too, but it had been blurry, indistinct, just a figure in a suit against a plain wall. She'd assumed it was the photographer's fault. Now, as passengers began to disembark, she scanned each face with growing anxiety. A businessman with a handlebar mustache, a woman with 2 squalling children, an elderly couple moving slowly, supporting each other, a cowboy in dusty chaps, tobacco staining his teeth as he grinned at someone on the platform. And then, there. Martha's breath caught. He was thin, not just slim or lean, but genuinely worryingly thin. His suit jacket hung on him like it was draped over a coat rack rather than a human frame. Wire-rimmed glasses sat askew on a narrow face, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. His hair, dark and slightly too long, lifted in the prairie wind as he stepped carefully down from the train car, one hand gripping his battered carpet bag, the other pushing his glasses back up his nose. He couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds soaking wet. "Sweet Jesus," Martha breathed. Beside her, Tom Bridger, the station master, let out a low whistle. "That him?" Martha couldn't find words. She just nodded. "Well," Tom scratched his beard, barely concealing his amusement. "Hope you didn't order him for heavy lifting, ma'am." The comment sparked laughter from the small crowd. Martha felt heat creep up her neck, but she lifted her chin and stepped forward, forcing her feet to move even as her mind raced with calculations. How was this man, this collection of bones held together by threadbare clothing, supposed to help run a farm? How would he survive the work? The winters? The sheer physical demands of prairie life? The man, Silas, it had to be Silas, was looking around the platform with an expression of nervous hope. When his eyes landed on Martha, something shifted in his face. Recognition, followed by relief, followed by something that might have been wonder. He walked toward her, and even his walk was wrong. Not the confident stride of a working man, but the careful, measured pace of someone who spent more time with books than with livestock. Still, he held himself straight, shoulders back despite their narrowness. "Miss Ellison?" His voice was softer than she'd expected, cultured, with an Eastern accent that marked him as clearly out of place as his thin frame. "Martha?" "Mr. Crane." She managed to keep her voice steady even as her mind screamed warnings. "Welcome to Red Hollow. Please, call me Silas." He set down his carpet bag and extended his hand. His grip, when she took it, was gentle but not weak. His fingers were long, ink-stained, marked with the calluses of a man who held pens rather than plow handles. "I apologize for the delay. The train was held up in Dodge City. I hope you weren't waiting long." "No, Martha trailed off, acutely aware of the crowd watching them, judging. "I hope your journey was pleasant." "Long." Silas smiled, a shy expression that transformed his gaunt face into something almost warm. "But worth it, I think. Your letters made Kansas sound less like a destination and more like a possibility." It was such an odd thing to say, the kind of thing a poet might say, or a dreamer, not the kind of thing a farmer's husband should say. But before Martha could respond, Tom Bridger cleared his throat loudly. "Best get moving, folks. Got another train due in an hour." He shot Martha a look that was equal parts pity and amusement. "Congratulations on your marriage." They weren't married yet. That was supposed to happen at the church tomorrow, giving them both an evening to reconsider if either got cold feet. But Tom's tone made it clear what he thought of the match, and the ripple of laughter from the onlookers confirmed that the whole town shared his assessment. Martha felt her jaw tighten. "Thank you, Tom. We'll be going now." She turned to Silas, who was watching the exchange with an expression that was hard to read. Not defensive or embarrassed, just observant, like he was cataloging details for later consideration. "The wagon's this way." Martha picked up the smaller of his two bags before he could protest. It weighed almost nothing. "It's about a 40-minute ride to the farm." "I can carry that," Silas started, reaching for the bag. "I've got it." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. She softened her tone. "You must be tired from the journey." They walked to the wagon in silence, Martha painfully aware of the stares following them. She could practically hear the thoughts running through her neighbors' minds. That's her husband? That scarecrow? Good Lord, what was she thinking? The wagon was exactly where she'd left it, hitched to Patient, her elderly mare, who barely flicked an ear at their approach. Martha had loaded 2 bales of hay that morning, planning to stop by the Hendersons' place on the way home. Now, watching Silas carefully lift his carpet bag into the wagon bed, she wondered if that had been a mistake. "Before we go," Silas said quietly, still standing by the wagon, "I need to ask you something." Martha's stomach dropped. Here it came. He'd taken one look at the dusty town, the hard faces, the rough life ahead, and decided to get back on that train. She couldn't even blame him. "All right," she said, bracing herself. Silas pulled off his glasses and cleaned them on his handkerchief. A nervous gesture, she thought. When he put them back on, his eyes behind the lenses were the color of creek water in winter, gray-green and surprisingly direct. "In your letters, you were honest about what life would be like here. The work, the isolation, the hardship. I appreciated that honesty, and I tried to match it in my own responses." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I wasn't entirely forthcoming about my physical limitations." "I can see that," Martha said, then immediately regretted her bluntness. But Silas just nodded, unfazed. "I'm not a big man. Never have been. I was sick a lot as a child, scarlet fever, pneumonia. It left me diminished. I can't lift what other men lift. Can't work as long or as hard." He met her gaze steadily. "I won't lie and say I can, but I can promise you this. I'll pull my weight where I'm able. I can read, write, figure numbers. I can fix things, build things with tools, if not with brute strength. I can teach your brother. And I can—" He hesitated. "I can be a partner, if you'll let me. Not the husband you probably pictured, but a husband nonetheless." The honesty of it stunned her. Here, in front of half the town, this thin stranger was laying out his inadequacies like cards on a table, giving her every reason to refuse him. It would have been easy to say no, to send him back on the evening train, to tell herself she'd been right to doubt. But there was something in the way he stood there, not apologizing exactly, but not making excuses either, just stating facts and letting her decide. And God help her, she'd already made her decision months ago when she'd answered that advertisement. When she'd sealed those 7 letters and sent them east with prayers tucked between the pages. When she'd lain awake imagining a life that was less lonely, even if it wasn't easier. "Can you drive a wagon?" Martha asked. Silas blinked. "Yes." "Then climb up. It's time to go home." Relief washed over his face, though he tried to hide it. He climbed onto the wagon seat, awkwardly, she noted, like someone unused to it, and Martha pulled herself up beside him. She took up the reins, clicked her tongue at patient, and the wagon lurched into motion. They rode in silence for the first 10 minutes, leaving Red Hollow behind and heading into the open prairie. The late afternoon sun painted the grasslands gold, and the wind carried the smell of dust and distant rain. It was beautiful country in its harsh way, but Martha had long since stopped seeing the beauty. Now she just saw the work, fields that needed plowing, fences that needed mending, 100 tasks that required strength she didn't have and couldn't afford to hire. "Those bales," Silas said suddenly, nodding toward the hay in the wagon bed. "Where are they going?" "Henderson Place. Their barn flooded last week, lost most of their winterward feed. We're helping each other out until they can recover." "We?" "The neighbors. That's how it works out here. You help because someday you'll need help." Silas nodded slowly, absorbing this. "In Ohio, we had barn raisings. Similar principle." "Similar," Martha agreed. Then, because the silence was becoming uncomfortable, "You taught school there?" "For 6 years, grades 1 through 8, all in one room." A small smile tugged at his mouth. "Chaos most days, but good chaos. I liked the work." "Why'd you leave?" The smile faded. "The town couldn't afford to pay me anymore. Too many families moved away after the mill closed. They offered to keep me on for room and board alone, but..." He shrugged. "A man has to be practical." Practical. The same word she'd used to justify her own choices. Maybe they had more in common than appearances suggested. "How old is your brother?" Silas asked. "Samuel, right?" 15, almost 16. Smart boy, but he's had to work more than study these past few years. Father died when he was 10. Mother 2 years after that. It's been hard on him." "I imagine it's been hard on you too." The simple observation, stated without pity or judgment, made Martha's throat tighten unexpectedly. She kept her eyes on the road. "We've managed." "I'm sure you have." Silas adjusted his glasses. "But managing and thriving are different things. Maybe together we can do more than just manage." It was a nice thought. Martha wanted to believe it. But as the wagon hit a rut and she watched Silas grab the seat to steady himself, his thin arms shaking with the effort, doubt crept back in like an unwelcome guest. The Henderson Place appeared on the horizon, a cluster of buildings huddled against the endless sky. As they pulled into the yard, Martha saw John Henderson working on his barn roof, and his wife Mary hanging laundry. 3 children played in the dirt nearby, shrieking with laughter as they chased a speckled hen. John climbed down from the roof as the wagon approached, wiping his hands on his pants. He was a big man, barrel-chested and strong, exactly the kind of man Martha should have married if she'd had the choice. His expression shifted from friendly to curious as he took in Silas sitting beside her. "Martha, didn't expect you till tomorrow." His eyes flickered to Silas, questions written clear on his face. "Train came early." Martha set the brake and climbed down. "Brought your hay, and this is Silas Crane. We're getting married tomorrow." "Is that so?" John's handshake with Silas was probably harder than necessary. "John Henderson. That's my wife Mary, and those demons are our children." "Pleased to meet you," Silas said evenly. If the crushing handshake bothered him, he didn't show it. "Help me unload this hay, will you?" John was already moving to the wagon bed. "Silas doesn't..." Martha started, but Silas was already following John. She watched, heart in her throat, as John grabbed one of the heavy bales with practiced ease and hefted it onto his shoulder. Silas looked at the second bale, then at his own arms, and Martha could see the calculation happening. He bent, got his arms around the bale, and tried to lift. The bale moved approximately 6 inches before Silas had to set it down, breathing hard. "Heavy," he said simply. John's expression was carefully neutral, but Martha saw the judgment there. Kansas hay, dense as they come. "Let me try a different approach." Silas studied the bale for a moment, then began rolling it toward the edge of the wagon. "Could you grab that end if I lower it down?" Together, with Silas maneuvering and John taking the weight, they got the second bale off the wagon. It wasn't graceful, and it took 3 times as long as it should have, but they managed. "Appreciate the help," John said when they were done. His tone suggested he was being generous with the word help. "You folks want to come in for coffee?" "Thank you, but we should get home before dark." Martha wanted nothing more than to escape the awkward tension. "Give our best to Mary." Back on the wagon, heading toward home, Silas was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not going to be able to do that, am I? Lift bales like that." Martha could have lied, could have offered false encouragement. Instead, she chose honesty. "No." "I see. But there are other things. I know." Silas cut her off gently. "You don't have to list them to make me feel better. I know what I can and can't do. He paused. "I just wanted you to know that I know." It was the most honest conversation Martha had ever had with a man, including her own father. No bluster, no false pride, just acknowledgement of reality. There was something almost refreshing about it, even if the reality itself was disappointing. The sun was setting by the time Martha's farm came into view. It wasn't much. A small house with a lean-to addition, a barn that needed new shingles, a chicken coop, 20 acres of wheat, and another 40 of grazing land. The fence posts marched away toward the horizon like crooked teeth, several leaning badly. Samuel was in the yard splitting firewood when they pulled up. He paused mid-swing, axe raised, as he caught sight of Silas. Martha's heart sank at the expression on her brother's face, surprise giving way to barely concealed disappointment. "Sam, this is Silas Crane." She climbed down from the wagon, trying to sound cheerful. "Silas, my brother Samuel." "Sir." Samuel set down the axe and approached, but his handshake was perfunctory. At 15, he was already taller than Silas and twice as broad across the shoulders, all youthful muscle and restless energy. He'd grown up doing man's work, and it showed. "Samuel." Silas looked up at the boy, and it was up, Martha noted with internal dismay, with genuine warmth. "Your sister's written a lot about you. She says you've been the man of this farm for 5 years now." Samuel's expression flickered, caught between pride and resentment. Somebody had to be. "That must have been difficult, taking on that responsibility so young." "I managed." The boy's tone was defensive, and Martha recognized the same words she'd used earlier, the same stubborn insistence on strength. "I'm sure you did." Silas picked up his carpet bag. "Well, I won't pretend I'm here to take over. Seems to me you've got a good handle on things. I'm just here to assist, learn what I can." It was the right thing to say, Martha thought, respectful without being condescending. But Samuel just shrugged and turned back to his firewood. "Supper's in an hour. I'll finish this." The house was smaller than Silas had probably imagined, Martha thought as she led him inside. 2 rooms and a loft, the main room serving as kitchen and living space, a single bedroom off to the side where Martha slept, and the loft above where Samuel had his space. There would need to be a rearrangement after the wedding, but Martha hadn't let herself think too hard about those logistics. "You can put your things here for now." She indicated a corner near the cold stove. We'll figure out arrangements after tomorrow." Silas set down his bag and looked around the space with the same careful observation he'd shown at the train station. Taking inventory, Martha thought, calculating what he'd gotten himself into. "It's a good house," he said finally. "Solid, well kept. My father built it. The lean-to was his addition when Samuel was born." Martha busied herself with lighting the stove, needing something to do with her hands. "It's not fancy, but it keeps the weather out." "Fancy is overrated." Silas removed his jacket and hung it carefully on a peg by the door. In just his shirt, he looked even thinner, his collarbone sharp beneath the fabric. "What can I do to help with supper?" Martha almost told him to sit down and rest, but something in his expression stopped her. He was offering to work, not asking for charity. Can you peel potatoes? I can learn. She handed him a knife and a bowl of potatoes, then showed him the technique. His hands were clumsy at first, more accustomed to chalk and books than kitchen knives, but he caught on quickly. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the scrape of peeling and the crackle of the fire coming to life in the stove. Samuel came in just as Martha was putting the stew pot on to boil. He'd cleaned up at the pump outside, his hair dark with water, and he nodded to the table. I'll set it. Supper was a quiet affair. Martha had made venison stew, the last of the meat from a deer Samuel had shot in early fall, with potatoes, carrots, and the herbs she'd managed to keep alive in her kitchen garden. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling, and there was enough of it. Silas ate with evident appreciation, though Martha noticed he took smaller portions than Samuel did. The boy, meanwhile, was putting away food like there was no tomorrow, growing body demanding fuel. Between them, Martha picked at her own meal, too aware of the awkwardness to have much appetite. This is excellent, Silas said after a few bites. Is that sage I'm tasting? And a little thyme. Martha was oddly pleased he'd noticed. My mother taught me. She always said the right herbs could make even poor ingredients sing. She was right. Silas set down his spoon. Samuel, your sister tells me you've been working this farm mostly alone for several years. Samuel looked up warily. What of it? I'm just impressed. That's skilled work, and you're clearly good at it. Silas leaned back in his chair. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to teach me some of it. I know my way around books, but farming is a different language entirely. The boy's suspicion warred with something else, perhaps appreciation for being acknowledged, or maybe just surprise at being asked rather than told. You really don't know anything about farming? Not a thing. I can tell you about Shakespeare's sonnets or the proper construction of a complex sentence, but I couldn't tell wheat from barley if my life depended on it. Despite herself, Martha saw Samuel's mouth twitch toward a smile. That's pretty useless out here. Extremely useless, Silas agreed cheerfully. Though I'm hoping it won't always be that way. I'm a quick study when properly motivated. I guess I could show you some things. Samuel returned to his stew, but there was less hostility in his posture now. Basic stuff, anyway. I'd appreciate it. After supper, while Samuel headed back outside to finish his chores, Martha and Silas tackled the dishes. The domesticity of it was strange, working side by side with this near stranger who would become her husband in less than 24 hours. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms that were all tendon and bone, and Martha found herself wondering how those thin arms had carried his own baggage this far, much less how they'd handle farm work. You're worried, Silas said quietly, not looking at her. Martha paused mid-scrub. Should I not be? I'd be worried if you weren't. He dried a plate with careful precision. I'm worried too, if it helps. About what? About being what you need. About being enough. He set the plate on the shelf and turned to face her. I know I'm not what you expected, Martha. I know what people see when they look at me. A scarecrow, as your station master so eloquently put it. Someone who will break in the first strong wind. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. His gray-green eyes were steady behind his glasses. But here's what I've learned in my 32 years. Strength comes in different forms. I may not lift bales, but I've outlived scarlet fever and pneumonia when doctors said I wouldn't. I've survived poverty that would have broken stronger men. I've built a life from nothing more than determination and a willingness to keep trying when everything suggested I should quit. He paused. I won't tell you not to worry, but maybe wait a bit before deciding I'm not enough. Martha found herself without words. In the silence, the clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time toward tomorrow, toward a future that was still uncertain but perhaps not entirely hopeless. All right, she said finally. I'll wait. That night, Martha lay awake in her bed, listening to the house settle around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Samuel's soft snoring from the loft, and from the main room where Silas had insisted on sleeping on the floor with blankets, the occasional creak of boards as he shifted position. Tomorrow, she'd marry him. Tomorrow, he'd become her husband, partner, helpmate. Tomorrow, they'd stand before Reverend Matthews and vow to support each other through whatever came. But tonight, in the honest darkness, Martha let herself acknowledge the fear that had been growing all day. This thin, frail man, how would he survive Kansas? How would he survive the brutal summers and frozen winters, the back-breaking work and crushing isolation? How would he lift what needed lifting, bear what needed bearing? And if he couldn't, when he couldn't, what then? Would she have traded her loneliness for a different kind of burden? Would she spend her life worrying about him instead of leaning on him? Through the wall, she heard Silas cough, a dry, harsh sound that suggested weakness in his lungs. Martha closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just whispered into the dark, "Please, please let this work." But the darkness offered no guarantees, only the promise of morning and whatever came with it. Outside, the Kansas wind swept across the prairie, indifferent to human hopes and fears. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a reminder that storms always came eventually, and when they did, you'd better hope your shelter was strong enough to hold. Morning came too quickly, announced by roosters crowing and the pale light of dawn creeping through the thin curtains. Martha had barely slept, and when she finally dragged herself from bed, her eyes felt gritty and her head ached with exhaustion. Today was her wedding day, though it felt nothing like she'd imagined wedding days should feel when she was a girl dreaming in her mother's kitchen. She dressed carefully in the dove-gray dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral, the nicest thing she owned, and braided her hair with fingers that trembled slightly. Through the wall, she could hear movement in the main room, the clatter of the stove being stoked, the smell of coffee beginning to brew. When she emerged, Silas was already dressed in his suit, the same one from yesterday, she realized, probably the only one he owned, and had somehow managed to make breakfast. Johnny cakes were warming on the griddle, and he'd found the jar of preserves she'd made last summer. "Good morning," he said, looking up from the stove. His hair was neatly combed, his glasses clean, and if she didn't look too closely at the way his collar hung loose around his thin neck, he looked almost presentable. "I hope you don't mind. I thought you might want to sleep a bit longer. You didn't have to do this." Martha moved to the table, surprised by the gesture. "I wanted to." He flipped a Johnny cake with surprising dexterity. "Besides, I figured I should start earning my keep somewhere. If I can't lift bales, I can at least manage breakfast." Samuel clattered down from the loft, his hair standing up in all directions. He stopped short at the sight of Silas cooking, something crossing his face too quickly for Martha to read. Then he shrugged and sat down at the table. "Smells good," he admitted grudgingly. They ate in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the day would bring. The wedding was set for 10 o'clock at the small church in Red Hollow, and Martha knew the whole town would turn out, not out of love for her necessarily, but because there was precious little entertainment on the prairie, and a spinster marrying a mail-order husband made for fine gossip. The ride back to town felt both too long and too short. Silas drove the wagon this time, his hands light but steady on the reins, and Martha found herself studying him from the corner of her eye. In the morning light, he looked less like a scarecrow and more like what he actually was, a man who'd been worn thin by life but hadn't broken yet. There was something in the set of his jaw, the way he held himself upright despite his obvious physical limitations, that suggested a different kind of strength than what she'd been looking for. But was it enough? That question gnawed at her as Red Hollow's buildings appeared on the horizon. The church was small, whitewashed, with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left from years of Kansas wind. Reverend Matthews was waiting on the steps, his Bible tucked under one arm, his expression kindly but reserved. He was a practical man who'd married dozens of couples on the frontier, and he knew better than most that marriages out here were often matters of survival rather than romance. "Martha, Mr. Crane." He shook both their hands. "Shall we proceed?" Inside, the church was already half full. Martha recognized most of the faces, the Hendersons in the second pew, Tom Bridger from the station near the back, the widow Morrison with her perpetual frown, young Sally Chen with her parents. All eyes turned as Martha walked down the short aisle, with Silas beside her, and she heard the whispers start immediately. "Lord have mercy, he's a twig. Give him one winter, he'll be dead. Poor Martha." Out of the frying pan. Silas's expression didn't change, but Martha saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She wanted to turn around and tell them all to mind their own business, to give him a chance before passing judgment. But this was the frontier, and judgment came quick as lightning and twice as harsh. Samuel slid into the front pew as they reached the altar. Reverend Matthews opened his Bible and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, words that had joined countless couples in this very spot. Martha tried to focus on them, on their meaning and weight, but her mind kept wandering to the whispers behind her, to the thin man standing at her side, to the enormous gamble she was taking. Do you, Martha Jean Ellison, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Martha looked at Silas. His gray-green eyes met hers steadily. No expectation in them. No demand. Just a quiet question. Are you sure? She thought about her empty house, her struggling farm, her brother growing up too fast with too much responsibility. She thought about 7 letters that had made her laugh and think and feel less alone. She thought about a man honest enough to admit his limitations rather than hide them. I do, she said, and meant it. And do you, Silas John Crane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Silas's voice was quiet but firm, carrying clearly through the small church. Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas, I pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Matthews closed his Bible. You may kiss your bride. Silas hesitated for just a moment, then leaned in and pressed a chaste kiss to Martha's lips. It was brief, almost formal, but something in the gentleness of it made her chest tighten unexpectedly. They were married. For better or worse, she'd bound her life to this thin stranger who couldn't lift a bale of hay, but who made good coffee and wrote beautiful letters. God help them both. The congregation filed out after them, offering congratulations that ranged from genuinely warm to barely concealed skepticism. Mrs. Henderson hugged Martha tightly and whispered, "Give him time, dear. You never know." Tom Bridger clapped Silas on the shoulder, too hard, Martha noticed, and said, "Welcome to Kansas, friend. Hope you're tougher than you look." John Henderson was more direct. He cornered them on the church steps, his big hands crossed over his chest. "Listen, Crane, I don't know you from Adam, but Martha's good people. She's had a hard few years, and she doesn't need anyone making things harder. You understand?" "I do," Silas said evenly, "and I appreciate your concern for her. That's what neighbors should do, look out for each other." John's eyes narrowed, trying to decide if he was being mocked. But Silas's expression was sincere, open, and after a moment John nodded grudgingly. "All right then, you need help getting set up. You let me know. That's what neighbors do too." "I will. Thank you." The ride home was quieter than the ride there had been. Samuel had gone ahead on the old plow horse, giving them privacy that felt more awkward than kind. Martha sat beside her new husband, this man who was now legally entitled to everything she owned, everything she'd worked for. It should have felt romantic, momentous. Instead, it just felt strange. "You're thinking very loudly," Silas observed. Despite herself, Martha almost smiled. "Am I?" "You get a line right here." He touched his own forehead between his eyebrows. "When you're worrying about something, I noticed it yesterday." "You notice a lot." "Occupational hazard. Teachers learn to read faces quickly, helps avoid spitballs, and worse." He adjusted his glasses. "Want to tell me what you're thinking, or should I keep guessing?" Martha considered lying, offering some pleasant platitude, but they'd started this relationship with honesty, and she figured they ought to continue that way. "I'm thinking that I just married a stranger, and wondering if I've made a terrible mistake." "That's fair." Silas didn't sound offended. "I married a stranger too, and I'm wondering the same thing." "Are you?" She turned to look at him. "Of course. This could go 100 different ways, most of them badly. You could decide I'm useless and resent me for it. I could fail at everything I try and prove everyone right. We could be miserable together for the next 40 years. He paused. "Or we could figure out how to make it work. But I won't know which until we try." "That simple?" "That complicated." He smiled slightly. "But we're in it now. Might as well give it our best effort. They arrived home to find Samuel had already started on the afternoon chores, mucking out the barn with aggressive efficiency that suggested he had feelings about the morning he was working out through physical labor. Martha started to go help him, but Silas caught her arm gently. "Could I try?" he asked. "Working with him, I mean. You must have other things to do." Martha hesitated. Samuel's temper had been uncertain all morning, and throwing Silas into the mix seemed like asking for trouble. But she also knew her brother needed to get used to having another man around, and delaying that wouldn't make it easier. "All right," she said, "but if he's rude, he's 15 and his life just changed without his permission. I taught 15-year-olds for 6 years. I think I can handle it." Martha watched Silas walk to the barn, his thin frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. Then she turned to the house and the mountain of tasks waiting there. Laundry that needed doing, bread that needed baking, the 1,000 small things that kept a household running. In the barn, Silas found Samuel attacking the dirty straw with a pitchfork like it had personally offended him. The boy looked up at his approach, wariness and challenge in his eyes. "Need something?" Samuel's tone wasn't quite rude, but it wasn't friendly either. "Thought I'd help." Silas looked around for another pitchfork, found one leaning against the wall. "If you don't mind teaching me the proper technique." "It's mucking a stall. Not exactly complicated." "Maybe not, but I'd rather do it right than do it wrong." Silas hefted the pitchfork experimentally. It was heavier than he'd expected, the handle worn smooth from years of use. "Besides, if we're going to be working together, we might as well start somewhere." Samuel stabbed his pitchfork into the straw pile. "You mean if you last that long?" There it was, the heart of the matter, laid bare with adolescent bluntness. Silas set down his pitchfork and leaned against the stall door. "You think I'm going to leave? I think you took one look at this place and realized what you signed up for. I think you're going to try for a few weeks, maybe a month, and then you'll head back east where things are easier." Samuel's voice was hard, but underneath Silas heard something else. Fear, maybe, or hurt. "That's what men do. They leave." "Your father didn't leave. He died." "Same result." Samuel kicked at the straw. "Martha's been the only constant thing in my life since I was 10. She's worked herself half to death keeping this place running, keeping me fed and clothed. And now she's married you, and everyone in town thinks you'll either die or run before winter. So forgive me if I'm not thrilled about the situation." The honesty of it was brutal, but Silas appreciated it more than false politeness. He'd rather know where he stood, even if where he stood was on very shaky ground. "You're right to be skeptical," he said finally. "I'm not strong like your father probably was. I'm not even strong like you are. I can't promise I won't die, although I've been managing not to for 32 years despite everyone's predictions otherwise. And I can't promise this will work out the way your sister hopes." "Then why are you here?" "Because I was tired of being alone. Because your sister's letters made me think maybe there was a place in the world where I could be useful, even if I'm not what most people consider strong. Because I thought—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I thought maybe strength comes in different forms, and maybe this family could use a different kind." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, studying him with eyes that seemed too old for 15. "What kind of strength do you have?" "I'm still figuring that out," Silas admitted. "But I'm not going anywhere while I do. That's a promise." "Promises are easy to make. And hard to keep, I know." Silas picked up his pitchfork again. "So watch me keep this one. Now, are you going to teach me how to muck this stall properly, or should I just guess?" The ghost of a smile flickered across Samuel's face. "You guess wrong. You'll hurt yourself. These pitchforks are heavier than they look." "Everything on a farm is heavier than it looks," Silas said dryly. "I'm learning that quickly." They worked together for the next hour, Samuel demonstrating techniques and Silas following as best he could. It was harder work than teaching had ever been, even on his worst days managing 30 students in a hot classroom. Within 20 minutes, his back ached. Within 40, his hands were blistered despite the calluses from holding pens. By the time they finished, he was sweating through his shirt and breathing hard. But the stall was clean, and Samuel was looking at him with something approaching respect. "You're slower than molasses," the boy observed, "but you don't quit. I'll give you that." High praise indeed. Silas leaned on his pitchfork, trying to catch his breath. "What's next?" Next, you should probably rest before you keel over. You look like death. I always look like death. Comes with the territory. But Silas was too tired to argue further. Maybe just for a few minutes. He made it to the porch steps before his legs gave out. He sat down heavily, his vision swimming slightly, cursing his weak lungs and weaker body. This was only the first day. How was he supposed to survive months of this? Years? Martha found him there 10 minutes later, still catching his breath, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion. She set down the laundry basket she'd been carrying and sat beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. "Samuel worked you hard," she said. It wasn't a question. "I asked him to teach me. He did." "You don't have to prove anything on the first day." "Don't I?" Silas looked at her. "Your whole town thinks I'll be dead or gone by winter. Your brother thinks the same. If I don't start proving otherwise now, when should I start?" Martha was quiet for a moment. "You know you can't will yourself into being stronger than you are." "No. But I can be as strong as I am, consistently, and maybe that will be enough." He flexed his blistered hands. "Or maybe it won't, and we'll all find out together." Inside the house, the clock chimed 4 times. Evening was approaching, bringing with it the need for supper, for more chores, for all the endless small tasks that filled a farmer's day. And beyond evening, night would come, their first night as husband and wife, with all the expectations and uncertainties that entailed. But for now, they sat together on the porch steps, 2 relative strangers who'd bound their lives together, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon. The Kansas wind carried the smell of dry grass and distant rain, and somewhere far off, a coyote called. "I'll make supper," Martha said eventually. "You rest." "We could make it together." Silas stood up slowly, his muscles protesting. "If you don't mind the company." "I don't mind." They worked side by side in the kitchen, falling into an easy rhythm, Martha directing, Silas following, both of them careful not to crowd the small space. There was something almost peaceful about it, domestic in a way Martha hadn't experienced since her mother died. It wasn't romance exactly, but it was partnership, and that counted for something. Samuel came in as they were setting the table, his hair wet from the pump, looking between them with an expression Martha couldn't quite read. He took his usual seat without comment, and they ate the simple meal of beans, cornbread, and the last of the bacon in a silence that was less awkward than the mornings had been. After supper, Martha announced she needed to check on the chickens, and Samuel quickly volunteered to help her, a transparent excuse to give the newlyweds privacy in the house. Silas started washing dishes, and Martha found herself watching him through the kitchen window, this thin man who was now her husband, wondering how they'd navigate the night ahead. When she came back inside, Silas had finished cleaning up and was sitting at the table with a book, one of the few Martha owned, a copy of Whitman's poems her mother had treasured. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing to the book. "I saw it on the shelf." "I don't mind." Martha hung her shawl on its peg. "Do you like Whitman?" "Very much. Your mother had good taste." "She did." Martha sat down across from him, folding her hands on the table. They needed to talk about sleeping arrangements, about expectations, about the practical realities of being married, but the words stuck in her throat. Silas closed the book carefully. "Martha, I want to be clear about something. I know what marriage typically entails, and I know we're legally bound now, but I don't expect, that is, I won't presume." He stopped, clearly struggling. "What I'm trying to say is that we're still strangers, and I think we should take time to become less strange to each other before there are certain expectations." Relief flooded through Martha so strongly it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you," she managed. "We'll figure out sleeping arrangements however you're comfortable. I'm perfectly fine on the floor, or we could hang a curtain for privacy, or—" "We'll hang a curtain," Martha decided. "Give us both some privacy while we adjust." They rigged up a blanket across one corner of the room, creating a small space where Silas could have his cot, Samuel's old one dragged down from the loft, and his few belongings. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small boundary in the strange new reality of being married. That night, lying in her own bed with her husband sleeping just feet away behind a thin blanket, Martha listened to the sounds of the house. Samuel's breathing from the loft, the wind outside, the creak of Silas shifting on his cot. It should have felt wrong, or at least strange, but instead there was something almost comforting about not being the only adult awake and alert, the only one bearing the weight of keeping everyone safe through the night. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, awkward at first but gradually smoothing into something almost comfortable. Silas rose early every morning and made coffee, a task he'd claimed as his own. He worked alongside Samuel learning farm tasks, moving slower than any man Martha had ever known, but with a determination that was hard to dismiss. He couldn't lift what needed lifting, couldn't work as long as Samuel could, but he found other ways to contribute. He repaired the broken gate on the chicken coop using wire and patience. He mended harnesses with careful stitches that held better than Martha's rushed ones ever had. He helped with the harvest, working at his own pace, taking breaks when his breathing became labored but always coming back. And in the evenings, he taught Samuel. Not just reading and writing, the boy could already do that, but history, mathematics, literature, things that made Samuel's eyes light up with an interest Martha hadn't seen in years. Her brother had been so consumed by survival that he'd forgotten there was more to life than work. The neighbors noticed too. When Martha went to town for supplies the following week, the whispers had shifted. They still doubted Silas would make it through winter, still questioned his usefulness, but there was a grudging acknowledgement that he was trying, at least. That counted for something on the prairie, where trying was often the difference between making it and breaking. 3 weeks into the marriage, John Henderson stopped by with a proposal. "Got a fence needs mending on the eastern border," he said, directing his words mostly to Samuel. "Could use some help if you've got a day to spare. Pay you in grain for winter." "We'll be there," Samuel said immediately, then glanced at Silas. "I mean, Silas and I will come." John's expression was doubtful. "It's heavy work, son. Fence posts need replacing." "I can dig post holes," Silas said quietly, "and I can work a saw. Between the two of us, we'll manage." "If you say so." John didn't sound convinced, but he nodded. "Tomorrow morning, then, early." That night, Martha watched Silas pack tools with careful deliberation, checking each one twice. His hands, she noticed, had developed new calluses to go with the ink stains. His face had more color from working in the sun, though he was still far too thin. "You don't have to prove anything to John Henderson," she said. "I'm not doing it for him." Silas looked up from the toolbox. "I'm doing it because neighbors help each other, and we're neighbors now. Besides, I need the practice. The only way I'm going to get stronger is by working. And if you hurt yourself, then I'll heal and try again." He smiled slightly. "I'm stubborn, Martha. It's one of my better qualities." The next morning, Silas and Samuel left before dawn, riding together in the wagon. Martha watched them go, her heart tight with worry she couldn't quite name. She spent the day working through chores with unusual vigor, trying not to imagine all the ways Silas could injure himself. They returned just before supper, both filthy and exhausted. Samuel was grinning, though a real smile Martha hadn't seen in months. And Silas looked half dead, his face gray with exhaustion, his hands bloody from rope burns. But there was satisfaction in his eyes. "We did it," Samuel announced. "Fixed half the fence already. John said we're the best team he's seen in months." "He said that?" Martha helped Silas down from the wagon, feeling how much he was shaking. "Well, he said, you boys didn't screw it up too bad." Samuel's grin widened, but from Mr. Henderson, that's high praise. That night, Martha insisted on treating Silas's hands, wrapping them in clean cloth after washing away the blood and dirt. He sat patiently while she worked, too tired to protest. "You worked too hard," she said, not quite scolding. "Probably, but we got it done." "At what cost?" "At the cost of some skin and a lot of soreness. I'll live." He looked at his bandaged hands. "And tomorrow I'll do it again. That's what farmers do, isn't it? They get up and do it again." Martha met his eyes, seeing the determination there mixed with exhaustion. He was fighting so hard to be enough, to prove he belonged here. Part of her wanted to tell him to stop, to rest, to accept his limitations. But another part, a growing part, was beginning to understand that this stubborn refusal to quit was its own kind of strength. "Yes," she said finally. That's what farmers do. The weeks blurred into a month, and then 6 weeks. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints that winter was coming. The wheat harvest finished successfully, with Silas working shorter hours than Samuel but contributing nonetheless. They had enough grain stored for winter, enough hay for the livestock, enough firewood stacked against the coming cold. The house settled into new patterns. Samuel's resentment faded into something like cautious friendship. Martha found herself relying on Silas for small things, his opinion on repairs, his help with evening tasks, his quiet presence at the end of long days. And the blanket curtain between them came down one night without discussion, replaced by an understanding that they could share space without demanding more than either was ready to give. They still hadn't consummated the marriage, but they'd built something else, a partnership based on mutual respect and growing trust. It wasn't what Martha had imagined when she'd sent those first letters east, but it was real, and it was working. Then, 7 weeks after the wedding, the first real test came. Martha woke to the sound of Silas coughing, harsh, wet, rattling coughs that spoke of lungs filling with fluid. She lit a lamp and found him curled on his side, his breathing labored, his face flushed with fever. "It's nothing," he managed between coughs. "Just a cold. I'll be fine by morning." But morning brought worse, not better. The fever climbed, the coughing intensified, and when Martha pressed her hand to his forehead, the heat shocked her. She'd seen this before. Pneumonia, the killer of the frontier, especially dangerous for someone with weak lungs like Silas. "Samuel," she called up to the loft, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ride to town. Fetch Dr. Pritchard. Tell him it's urgent." The boy scrambled down, took one look at Silas, and ran for the barn without asking questions. Martha heard the horse galloping away moments later, and then she was alone with her sick husband, watching him struggle for breath. This was it, she thought, the moment everyone had predicted. Silas Crane, too weak for Kansas, brought down by the first real illness of the season. Part of her wanted to rage at the unfairness of it. He'd worked so hard, tried so desperately to prove himself. But the frontier didn't care about effort or determination. It took who it wanted, when it wanted. She spent the day fighting the fever with cool cloths and willow bark tea, forcing him to drink even when he could barely swallow. His breathing grew worse, each inhalation a visible effort, and Martha found herself praying with an intensity she hadn't felt since her mother's death. "Don't you dare," she whispered, gripping his hot hand. "Don't you dare die on me, Silas Crane. We have a deal." His eyes fluttered open briefly, fever bright and unfocused. "Not planning to," he rasped. "Too stubborn." Dr. Pritchard arrived at sunset, his expression grim as he examined Silas. Pneumonia. He confirmed what Martha already knew. Bad case too, with lungs like his. He trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. "What can we do?" Martha demanded. "Keep the fever down, keep him drinking, keep him breathing." The doctor pulled out a bottle of medicine. "Give him this every 4 hours. And pray, Mrs. Crane. That's about all we can do." For 3 days, Martha barely slept. She kept vigil by Silas's side, sponging his fevered skin, forcing medicine down his throat, propping him up when the coughing threatened to choke him. Samuel helped when he could, but the farm still needed tending, so it was mostly Martha alone with her husband, watching him fight for every breath. On the third night, the fever peaked. Silas's breathing became so labored that Martha thought each breath might be his last. She held his hand and talked to him, about the farm, about his letters, about the life they were building together. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she talked anyway, unwilling to let him slip away in silence. "You promised," she said, her voice breaking. "You promised you wouldn't leave. You said you'd pull your weight where it counts. Well, it counts here, Silas. It counts now. So fight. Please, fight." As dawn broke on the 4th day, the fever finally broke. Silas's breathing eased, his color improved, and when he opened his eyes, they were clear for the first time in days. "Martha?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here." She gripped his hand tighter. "You're going to be all right." "Told you." Stubborn. Despite everything, Martha laughed. A sound caught between relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been the beginning of love. Recovery was slow, measured in days that stretched like taffy in the Kansas sun. Silas could barely sit up without his head spinning, could barely speak without coughing, and the simple act of crossing the room left him breathless and shaking. Dr. Pritchard had warned Martha it would be weeks before he was back to even his baseline strength, and she'd nodded grimly, already calculating how they'd manage the work with one man down. But what she hadn't expected was how the illness changed things between them. On the 5th day after the fever broke, Martha brought him broth and found him trying to stand, one hand gripping the bedpost, his legs trembling with the effort. She set down the bowl and moved to his side without thinking, slipping her arm around his waist to steady him. "What are you doing?" she asked, though her tone held more concern than anger. "Trying not to be useless." His voice was still rough, scraped raw from days of coughing. "I need to get up, move around. Can't build strength lying in bed. You need to heal. I am healing, but I'll heal faster if I'm moving." He looked at her, and something in his expression was different than before. Softer, maybe, or more open. "I heard you, you know. When I was sick." Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do." Silas managed a weak smile. "You told me not to leave, said we had a deal. You were delirious with fever. You probably imagined it." "I imagined a lot of things during those 3 days, but not that." He squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you, Martha, for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself." She didn't know what to say to that, so she just helped him to the chair by the window and handed him his broth. He drank it slowly, his hand still shaking slightly, and Martha found herself watching him with new eyes. This thin, frail man had stared down death and refused to blink. Maybe everyone had been wrong about him. Maybe she'd been wrong about him. Samuel came in from the morning chores, his boots caked with mud, and stopped short at seeing Silas in the chair. "You're up." "Barely." Silas set down the empty bowl. "But I'm tired of watching the ceiling. Tell me what needs doing. Maybe I can help somehow." "You need to rest," Samuel said, but there was something different in his voice too, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "But there is something you could help with if you're feeling up to it. The accounts are a mess. Martha's too busy to sort them, and I'm terrible with numbers. You said you were good at that sort of thing." "I am." Silas straightened slightly, and Martha saw what the request meant to him. A way to contribute even from the chair, a way to be useful. "Bring them here. I'll see what I can do." For the next week, while Silas regained his strength, he became the farm's accountant. He spread the ledgers across the kitchen table and went through them with the same careful attention he'd probably given to lesson plans. Within 3 days, he'd found discrepancies Martha hadn't noticed, had reorganized their records, and had calculated exactly what they'd need to make it through winter with a small surplus. "You've been selling your wheat too cheap," he told Martha one evening, tapping the ledger with his pencil. "Henderson's been paying you 15 cents less per bushel than the going rate in Dodge City. I don't think he's cheating you intentionally. He's probably just paying what he's always paid, but you could get more." "John's our neighbor," Martha protested. "We can't." "It's not about friendship. It's about fair business." Silas looked up at her. "You're barely breaking even, Martha. One bad season, one major repair, and you'd be under. You can be neighborly and still demand fair prices. That's not greedy, it's survival." She'd never thought of it that way. Her father had always done business on handshakes and trust, and she'd continued that tradition. But Silas was right. Survival on the prairie required sharp calculation as much as it required hard work. The next time Henderson came by to negotiate for next year's crop, Martha quoted him the Dodge City price. He'd blustered and complained about costs, but ultimately he'd agreed, respecting her newfound business sense, even as it cost him money. And when he left, he'd clap Silas on the shoulder, gently this time, without the testing hardness, and said, "Good to see you on your feet, Crane. Gave us all a scare." By the end of October, Silas was back to working, though Martha insisted he take it slower than before. He'd lost weight during the illness, weight he couldn't afford to lose, and his stamina was even more limited than it had been. But he was alive and stubborn as ever, and gradually he rebuilt what the pneumonia had stolen. The neighbors' attitudes shifted too, subtly but unmistakably. Word had spread about Silas surviving the illness, about his work with the accounts, about the way he'd stubbornly refused to die when everyone expected him to. Respect on the frontier was earned in strange ways, sometimes through strength, sometimes through endurance, sometimes through pure cussed determination not to quit. Silas had earned his through all three. November brought the first snow, light dustings that melted by afternoon but heralded worse to come. Martha spent her days preparing for winter, canning the last of the vegetables, checking the roof for leaks, making sure they had enough of everything to survive until spring. It was during one of these preparations that she realized something had shifted in her marriage without her quite noticing when. She was in the root cellar counting potatoes when Silas climbed down the ladder, moving carefully in the dim light. Samuel says we should butcher the older chickens before the cold sets in hard. What do you think? It was such a simple question, the kind married couples probably asked each other a dozen times a day. But it struck Martha that he was asking, not telling, treating her as a partner whose opinion mattered. Her father had made all the decisions, and she'd assumed that's how marriage worked. The man decided, the woman followed. But Silas was different. That makes sense, she said. We can preserve the meat, use the feathers for pillows. We've been needing new ones. Then I'll help Samuel set up for it tomorrow. Silas paused, looking around the root cellar with its shelves of preserved goods. You've done good work here, Martha. Your family would be proud. The compliment, simple and sincere, made her throat tight. We've done good work. All of us. Have we? He met her eyes in the cellar's dim light. I've been thinking lately, wondering if I've been more burden than help. The pneumonia set us back, cost us money for the doctor, time you couldn't spare. Stop. Martha surprised herself with the force of the word. Just stop. Yes, you got sick. Yes, it was hard. But you survived and you came back and you're here. That counts for more than you know. Does it? His voice was quiet, vulnerable in a way she'd rarely heard. Because sometimes I look at what needs doing and I know I can't do half of it. I know Samuel could do more without having to slow down for me. I know you could have married someone stronger, more useful. I married you. Martha stepped closer, close enough to see the uncertainty in his gray-green eyes. Not someone else. You. And maybe I didn't know what I was getting into. Maybe neither of us did. But we're here now, and we're making it work. So stop questioning whether you're enough. You are. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. A real smile. Not the shy half-expression she'd grown accustomed to. When did you start believing that? When you refused to die. She said it simply, honestly. When you kept getting up every morning even when everything hurt. When you found ways to help that I never would have thought of. When you treated my brother like he mattered and not like cheap labor. When you... She stopped, surprised by how much she had to say. When I what? He prompted gently. When you became part of this place, she finished. Part of this family. The words hung in the cold cellar air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them had quite expected. Then Silas reached out and took her hand, his grip warm despite the chill. I'm glad I answered your advertisement, he said quietly. Even with everything, the doubt, the struggle, nearly dying. I'm glad. So am I. And Martha meant it with a certainty that would have shocked her 2 months ago. They climbed out of the cellar together, and that night the blanket curtain came down permanently. They still slept in separate beds. That intimacy would come in its own time, but there was no more pretending they were anything but fully married, fully committed to whatever came next. Winter arrived in earnest in mid-November with a blizzard that howled across the plains like something alive and hungry. Martha had lived through Kansas winters before, but this one felt different. Maybe because there was more at stake now, more people depending on the preparations she'd made. They were trapped in the house for 3 days while snow piled against the walls and wind screamed through every crack in the boards. Samuel fretted about the livestock, but Silas kept him occupied with lessons, turning the forced confinement into an opportunity. They read together, worked through mathematics problems, discussed history and science and literature. Martha listened while she worked on mending, amazed at how patient Silas was, how he could make even dry subjects interesting. Did you ever want children of your own? She asked one evening while Samuel slept in the loft, and they sat by the stove's warmth. Silas looked up from the book he'd been reading. I suppose I never thought I'd have the chance. Teaching other people's children seemed like the closest I'd get. And now? Now I'm teaching your brother, which feels close enough. He paused, studying her face. Are you asking if I'd want children with you? Martha felt heat rise to her cheeks. They'd been married 2 months and still hadn't consummated the marriage, still slept in separate beds like polite strangers. The question felt presumptuous and intimate all at once. "I don't know what I'm asking," she admitted. "I just realized I don't know much about what you want. From this marriage, from this life." Silas set down his book and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What do I want? I want to wake up every morning and not feel like I'm failing. I want to pull my weight, even if the weight I pull is different than what others pull. I want Samuel to have chances I never had. Education, options, a future beyond just surviving. I want this farm to thrive, not just endure." He paused. "And I want you to be happy, Martha, whatever that takes. What about your happiness?" "I'm getting there." He smiled slightly. "It's been a long time since I felt like I belonged anywhere. This place, this family. It's starting to feel like home. That's more happiness than I've had in years." The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day, revealing a world transformed by snow. They dug their way out of the house and to the barn, relieved to find the livestock had survived, though they'd used considerable feed. The next weeks were a constant battle against the cold, hauling water that froze in buckets, breaking ice in the trough, keeping the stove fed with wood that seemed to burn faster than they could cut it. But they managed. Day by day, task by task, they managed. It was during one of these brutal winter days that disaster struck. Samuel was chopping wood near the barn when the axe head, loosened by the cold, flew off mid-swing and caught him across the left arm. He stumbled into the house, bleeding through his coat, his face white with shock and pain. Martha and Silas both moved at once. Martha grabbed clean cloth while Silas eased Samuel into a chair and carefully removed the coat. The wound was deep, bleeding heavily, and Martha's hands shook as she pressed cloth against it. "Hold this." Silas took her hands and placed them firmly on the wound. "Press hard. Don't let up." Then he was moving with sudden purpose, gathering supplies. More cloth, the bottle of whiskey they saved for emergencies, needle and thread. "You know how to do this?" Martha asked, voice tight. "I've sewn up my share of children's injuries. This isn't much different, just deeper." Silas was already threading the needle, his hand steady despite his general frailty. "Samuel, this is going to hurt. The whiskey will help." "I don't need—" Samuel started, but Silas was already pressing the bottle to his lips. "Drink. That's not a request. It's medical necessity." The boy drank, coughing at the burn, and Silas waited until the alcohol had time to dull the edges before he began cleaning the wound. His hands were gentle but efficient, and Martha watched in amazement as this man who couldn't lift a bale of hay stitched her brother's arm with the precision of a surgeon. "Where did you learn this?" she asked, still pressing cloth to stem the bleeding while he worked. "When you teach in a one-room schoolhouse, you become doctor, nurse, and parent all at once." Silas's voice was calm, focused. "Had a boy split his head open on a desk corner once. Doctor was 2 hours away. I did what needed doing." Samuel hissed in pain as the needle pierced skin, but he stayed still, teeth gritted. Silas talked to him the whole time, keeping his voice low and steady, telling stories about his students' mishaps, making the boy focus on something other than the pain. When he finally tied off the last stitch, Samuel's arm was neatly closed. The bleeding stopped. Silas wrapped it in clean cloth and then slumped back in his chair, his hands trembling now that the crisis had passed. "You'll be sore for a while," he told Samuel, "and you need to keep it clean and dry. But you'll heal." "Thank you." Samuel's voice was thick with emotion. When it happened, I thought, "I know." Silas squeezed the boy's shoulder gently. "But you're all right. We're all right." That night, after Samuel had been settled in the loft with instructions to rest, Martha found Silas sitting at the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. He looked exhausted, the kind of deep weariness that went beyond physical. "That was amazing," she said, sitting across from him. "What you did today?" "It was necessary." "It was more than that. You saved him from infection, maybe worse. And you were so calm, so sure of yourself." Silas looked down at his hands. "When I was sick with pneumonia, lying there feeling useless, I kept thinking about all the ways I was failing you, all the things I couldn't do, couldn't be. And then today, When Samuel came in bleeding, I realized something. What's that? That strength isn't just about lifting heavy things. Sometimes it's about steady hands when everyone else is shaking. Sometimes it's about knowing what to do when others don't. Sometimes it's about being calm in a crisis. He met her eyes. I'll never be the husband who can throw bales like John Henderson, but maybe I can be the husband who knows how to stitch wounds and balance accounts and teach your brother calculus. Martha reached across the table and took his hand. You already are that husband. You have been since the day you arrived. Something shifted in his expression, and for the first time since they'd met, Martha saw him without the protective layer of self-deprecation, without the constant measuring of himself against others. She saw him as he was, a man who'd survived more than most, who'd found strength in unexpected places, who'd refused to let his limitations define him. Martha, he said quietly, and there was a question in the way he said her name. She understood what he was asking. They'd been married 3 months, had built trust and partnership, and something that was beginning to feel like love. They'd been dancing around this moment for weeks now, both of them waiting for the right time. Yes, she said simply. That night, they became husband and wife in full. It was awkward at first, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory, both conscious of Silas's physical limitations. But there was gentleness too, and care, and a tenderness that came from genuine affection rather than mere duty. When it was over, they lay together in the darkness, and Martha felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for years, a sense of rightness, of finally being less alone. I love you, Silas whispered, and it was the first time either of them had said the words. Martha took a breath, feeling the weight and truth of her own feelings. I love you too. The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound, and outside the window the Kansas wind sang its endless song across the frozen prairie. December brought more snow and colder temperatures, but the house felt warmer somehow, filled with something more than just the heat from the stove. The three of them had found their rhythm, each contributing what they could, supporting each other's weaknesses with their strengths. Samuel's arm healed cleanly, leaving only a thin scar and a story to tell. The livestock survived, the food held out, and Martha found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in the 6 years since her father died. Hope. Real hope. Not just the grim determination to survive another day, but actual optimism about the future. Christmas came quietly. They couldn't afford much, but Silas had carved small gifts, a horse for Samuel, a hair comb for Martha. Each piece worked with patient detail during the long winter evenings. Martha had knitted them both new scarves, and Samuel had trapped a turkey that they roasted for Christmas dinner. They ate by candlelight, the three of them around the small table, and said grace together. When Silas's hand found Martha's under the table and squeezed gently, she squeezed back, thinking about how much had changed since that day at the train station when she'd first seen him step off the train, thin as a scarecrow, looking like the wind could break him. He'd been tested by fire and ice, by illness and doubt, and the sheer brutal reality of frontier life. He'd bent, but not broken. And in the process, he'd proven something Martha was only now beginning to fully understand. Strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was in the steady accumulation of small victories, in the refusal to quit, in the willingness to find new ways when the old ways wouldn't work. Sometimes strength looked like a thin man with glasses, sitting at a kitchen table teaching mathematics, or carefully stitching wounds, or simply getting up each morning to face another day. The wind howled outside, promising more snow, more cold, more challenges to come. But inside the small farmhouse, lamplight glowed warm, and three people who'd become a family sat together in companionable silence. January would bring new trials, Martha knew. Spring would bring its own demands. Life on the prairie never got easier. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Silas paused by the window, looking out at the snow-covered fields gleaming in the moonlight. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Marrying me?" Martha came to stand beside him, slipping her arm around his thin waist. "Every day," she said, and felt him stiffen. Then she smiled. "I regret that I didn't meet you sooner, that we wasted years being alone when we could have been together. That's what I regret." Silas turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw emotion too deep for words, gratitude and love and wonder all mixed together. "I'm the luckiest man in Kansas," he said. "No," Martha corrected gently. "We're the luckiest people in Kansas, because we found each other when we needed each other most." She kissed him then, slow and sweet, and when they finally pulled apart, the wind had died down and the world outside was silent and still, blanketed in snow and moonlight and the promise of tomorrow. They went to bed together, husband and wife in truth, and Martha fell asleep with Silas's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, thinking that maybe the mail-order husband who'd looked too thin to lift a bale had turned out to be exactly what she needed after all. Not a man who could carry everything, but a man willing to carry what he could. Not a man without limitations, but a man who refused to be defined by them. Not the husband she'd imagined, but the husband she'd needed without knowing it. Outside, the Kansas winter deepened, but inside, warmth endured. And that, Martha thought as sleep claimed her, was its own kind of miracle. The new year arrived with temperatures so cold that water froze solid in the buckets before they could carry it from the well to the house. Martha woke on the first morning of 1885 to find frost patterns on the inside of the windows, and Silas already up, feeding the stove with quiet efficiency. He moved carefully in the pre-dawn darkness, trying not to wake her, but she watched him through half-closed eyes, this man who'd become essential to her life in ways she was still discovering. "I'm awake," she said finally, and he turned with a slight smile. "Happy New Year, Mrs. Crane." The name still felt strange on her ears, but increasingly it felt right too. "Happy New Year. How cold is it?" "Cold enough that I saw my breath in here before I got the fire going." He poured her coffee from the pot he'd already brewed. "We're going to need to check on the livestock early. Weather like this can kill animals fast." But they bundled up and went out together into a world transformed by cold into something alien and beautiful and deadly. The snow crunched under their feet with a sound like breaking glass, and their breath hung in the air in great white clouds. In the barn, the animals huddled together for warmth, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Martha checked each one while Silas distributed feed, both of them working with the practiced efficiency they'd developed over the winter months. They'd lost 2 chickens to the cold despite their best efforts, but the rest of the animals seemed all right, if miserable. "We need more straw in here," Silas observed, looking at the thin layer on the floor. "Extra insulation. We're running low. I was hoping to make what we have last until spring. Spring's still 2 months away at least, maybe 3 if this winter keeps up." He was already calculating. She could see it in his expression. "We could trade for more. Henderson might have extra." "We don't have much to trade. We have your preserves. Mary Henderson was admiring them at church last month, and I could offer to teach their oldest boy. He's 12 now, should be learning more than just farm work." It was so typical of Silas, Martha thought, to find value in things that weren't physical goods. He thought in terms of knowledge and skill, in services rendered rather than just commodities exchanged. It was one of the things that made him different from the other men she knew, and increasingly, it was one of the things she loved about him. "All right," she agreed. "When the weather breaks, we'll ride over." But the weather didn't break. It got worse. A second blizzard hit 3 days later, this one more vicious than the first, and they were trapped inside for nearly a week. The walls groaned under the wind's assault, and snow piled so high against the door they had to dig their way out each morning just to reach the barn. It was during this forced confinement that Martha realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks now, the missed monthly bleeding, the slight nausea in the mornings, the way her breasts had become tender. But she'd been afraid to say anything, afraid to hope, afraid of what it would mean if she was wrong. Now trapped in the house with nothing but time to think, she couldn't deny it anymore. She waited until Samuel was asleep in the loft and Silas was reading by lamplight before she spoke. "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, his expression shifting to concern at her tone. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think so." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm pregnant, Silas. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, he just stared at her, his face blank with shock. Then slowly, wonder spread across his features, transforming him. A baby, Are you certain? As certain as I can be without a doctor. But yes, I'm certain. Silas set down his book carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter the moment. When? Late summer, I think. August, maybe September. He stood and crossed to her, taking both her hands in his. Martha, His voice caught, and she saw his eyes were bright behind his glasses. I never thought I'd have this. A wife, a child, a family. I never let myself even hope for it. Are you happy? She asked, suddenly needing to hear him say it. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that acknowledged the precious cargo she now carried. Terrified, yes. Overwhelmed, absolutely. But happy? Martha, I'm so happy I can barely breathe. They stood there in the lamplight, wrapped in each other's arms, while outside the wind howled and the snow fell and the world tried its best to break them. But inside there was warmth and hope and the promise of new life growing where before there had been only loneliness and survival. The blizzard finally ended, and with it came a brief respite. Temperatures still cold but not deadly, sun breaking through the clouds for the first time in weeks. They made the trip to the Henderson place, the wagon loaded with Martha's preserves and Silas's offer of tutoring. Mary Henderson was delighted with the jams and pickles, and John grudgingly agreed to the tutoring arrangement, though Martha could see he still wasn't entirely convinced of Silas's worth. But he loaded their wagon with extra straw anyway, because that was how things worked on the frontier. You helped your neighbors even when you doubted their choices. Your husband's looking better, Mary said quietly to Martha while the men loaded the wagon. More color in his face, stronger. He is stronger. Martha watched Silas working alongside John, moving slower but steady, not trying to prove anything but just doing the work. Winter's been hard, but we're managing. More than managing, from what I hear. But Mary smiled. John says Silas knows more about crop rotation and soil management than most farmers who've been working land for 20 years. Says he's been reading books on it. He reads books on everything. Martha said it with a mixture of exasperation and affection. Our house is going to be nothing but books if he keeps buying them from the catalog. Could be worse things. Mary's expression turned more serious. Martha, I owe you an apology. When you first brought him home, I thought what everyone thought, that you'd made a mistake, married someone who couldn't hack it out here. But I was wrong. He's different than most men, but that doesn't make him less. If anything, it might make him more. The words warmed Martha more than she'd expected. Mary Henderson wasn't one for empty compliments, and her respect was hard-earned. If she'd changed her opinion of Silas, others probably had too. On the ride home, Martha told Silas about Mary's words. He was quiet for a long moment, guiding patient carefully around the worst of the snowdrifts. I'm glad she thinks better of me, he said finally. But I've stopped worrying so much about what others think. I know my worth now, even if it's measured differently than theirs. When did that change? When you told me you loved me. He glanced at her, a smile playing at his lips. Hard to doubt yourself when someone you respect believes in you. Martha leaned against his shoulder as much as the wagon seat would allow. We're going to need to build a cradle, and get more cloth for diapers, and figure out where we're going to put a baby in that tiny house. We'll manage. Silas's voice was confident in a way it hadn't been even a month ago. We always do. February brought a brief thaw, just long enough to remind them that winter wouldn't last forever, before temperatures plunged again. Martha's pregnancy progressed with minimal discomfort, some morning sickness, some fatigue, but nothing she couldn't work through. She continued her chores with Silas and Samuel, both watching her like hawks, ready to take over the moment she showed any sign of strain. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, she protested one afternoon when Silas tried to stop her from lifting a basket of laundry. I know that, but there's no harm in being careful. He took the basket from her anyway. Let me do the heavy work. Since when can you do the heavy work? The words came out harsher than she'd intended, old doubts surfacing despite everything. Silas set down the basket and looked at her steadily. You're scared. I'm not. You are. You're scared something will go wrong. With the baby, with me, with everything we've built. And you're taking it out on me because I'm an easy target. Martha wanted to deny it, but he was right. She was scared, terrified actually. Her mother had died giving birth to a baby that didn't survive, and Martha had been the one to find her, blood-soaked and still. The memory haunted her now that she was carrying life herself. "My mother died in childbirth," she said quietly. "The baby died too. I was 16. I found them both." Understanding flooded Silas's face. "Martha, why didn't you tell me?" "Because saying it out loud makes it real, makes the fear real." She sank onto the porch step, suddenly exhausted. "What if I die, Silas? What if the baby dies? What if we both do, and you and Samuel are left alone again?" He sat beside her, taking her cold hand in both of his. "Then we'd grieve, and we'd survive, and we'd carry you in our hearts forever. But Martha, you can't live your life preparing for tragedy. Yes, childbirth is dangerous. Yes, things can go wrong, but they can also go right. And you're strong, and we'll get Dr. Pritchard, and we'll do everything we can to make sure you and our baby both make it through." "You can't promise that." "No, I can't. But I can promise I'll be there with you every moment, that you won't face it alone like your mother did. That's something, isn't it?" It was something, more than something, actually. Martha leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady reassurance of his presence. He couldn't lift what others could lift, couldn't do what others could do. But he could be steady when she faltered, calm when she panicked, present when she needed someone to lean on. And maybe that was a different kind of strength, but it was strength nonetheless. March arrived with the first real hints of spring, temperatures above freezing, snow melting in great rushing streams, the earth beginning to thaw. It was the time when winter-weary farmers started planning for the season ahead, and the Crane household was no exception. Silas had spent the winter months reading every agricultural book he could get his hands on, and now he had plans. Big plans. "We should diversify the crops," he announced one evening over supper, spreading his notes across the table. "Wheat is good, but if we add corn and maybe some sorghum, we're not dependent on one harvest. And I've been reading about crop rotation. It actually improves soil quality if you do it right." Samuel leaned forward, interested despite himself. "How does that work?" "Different crops take different nutrients from the soil. If you rotate them properly, you never deplete any one nutrient too much. Plus, some crops, like legumes, actually put nitrogen back into the soil." Silas was in his element now, teaching mode fully engaged. "It's science, Sam. You can literally make your soil richer by planting smart." "Father always just planted wheat," Martha said, not quite skeptical but uncertain. "It's what everyone around here plants. And everyone around here struggles when wheat prices drop or the wheat crop fails." Silas pushed his glasses up his nose, a gesture she'd come to recognize as him preparing to make an argument. "I'm not saying don't plant wheat. I'm saying don't plant only wheat. Hedge your bets. It's basic economics." "It's also more work," Samuel pointed out. "Different crops need different care, different timing." "It is more work," Silas agreed. "But the payoff could be worth it. And I'll take on the extra planning and management. You two focus on the physical labor. I'll focus on the strategy." It was a fair division of labor that played to everyone's strengths. Martha found herself nodding slowly. "All right, we'll try it. But just a small section at first. See how it goes. That's all I'm asking, a chance to prove it can work." They started preparing the fields as soon as the ground was workable, Samuel driving the plow behind Patient while Silas walked alongside, marking out sections according to his carefully drawn plans. Martha watched from the porch, one hand on her growing belly, marveling at how much had changed in 6 months. The thin scarecrow of a man who'd stepped off the train in Red Hollow had become someone else. Not physically, not in the ways that were obvious to casual observers. He was still thin, still weak by most men's standards, still wore glasses that slipped down his nose. But there was a confidence in him now, a sureness of purpose that transformed him from someone who apologized for taking up space into someone who owned his place in the world. April brought rain and the backbreaking work of planting. Samuel did most of the heavy labor, but Silas was always there beside him, planting seeds according to his precise calculations, double-checking spacing and depth. And in the evenings, while Samuel's young muscles recovered, Silas taught him not just reading and mathematics anymore, but practical science, how plants grew, why weather mattered, the chemistry of soil and seed. Martha watched her brother slowly transform under Silas's patient instruction, saw him begin to think of farming not just as survival, but as a craft that could be mastered and improved. It was a gift Silas gave without even realizing it, the gift of seeing potential where others just saw dirt and sweat. The baby grew larger in Martha's belly, making her movements slower and more awkward. Dr. Pritchard came by in early May for a checkup, pronouncing both mother and child healthy, though he warned her to take it easy in the final months. Easier said than done on a farm, Martha muttered after he left. Then we make it done, Silas said firmly. Sam and I can handle most of the work. You focus on growing that baby. I can't just sit around for 4 months. You can supervise, plan meals, teach me to cook better, read those books you've been hoarding. He smiled at her. You've been taking care of everyone else for years, Martha. Let us take care of you for a while. It went against every instinct she had, every lesson her parents had taught her about pulling your own weight. But as the baby grew heavier and her back began to ache constantly, she found herself accepting help more readily. Silas took over most of the cooking, improving rapidly under her instruction. Samuel handled the heavy chores without complaint, and Martha learned the strange art of delegating, of trusting others to do what she'd always done herself. May slid into June, and the crops came up green and promising. Silas's diversification experiment was working. The corn sprouted in neat rows, the wheat grew tall and golden, and the small section of sorghum he'd insisted on showed surprising vigor. Neighbors started stopping by to see what Silas Crane was doing differently, and some even asked for advice on their own planting. Word's getting around that you're some kind of farming genius, Martha told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. I'm not a genius. I just read books and apply what I learn. But he looked pleased nonetheless. Though I won't lie, it feels good to be useful, to contribute something beyond just surviving. You've always contributed. Have I? He looked at her seriously. Sometimes I still wonder what you saw in me, Martha. What made you think a man who couldn't lift a bale could be a farmer's husband? Martha took his hand, lacing her fingers through his ink-stained, calloused ones. You want to know what I saw? I saw 7 letters that made me laugh when I hadn't laughed in months. I saw honesty when everyone else was trying to sell me something I couldn't afford. I saw someone who admitted his weaknesses instead of hiding them. She paused. And now? Now I see the father of my child, the man who saved my brother's life with steady hands and quick thinking, the man who's revolutionizing how we farm, the man who makes me coffee every morning and reads to me every night. That's what I see. Silas's eyes were bright behind his glasses. I love you, Martha Crane, more than I thought I could love anyone. I love you too, even when you're being insufferably intellectual about crop rotation. He laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine and happy. They sat together in the gathering dusk, hands entwined, while the field stretched out before them and the first stars began to appear overhead. July brought heat that made Martha feel like she was carrying a furnace inside her belly. The baby was active now, kicking and rolling at all hours, and she spent most of her time in the house, trying to stay cool and comfortable. Silas was attentive to the point of hovering, constantly checking on her, bringing her water, fanning her with a piece of cardboard when the heat became unbearable. I'm fine, she told him for the 100th time. Stop worrying. I'll stop worrying when you've safely delivered our child. He felt her forehead for fever. You're warm. It's July in Kansas. Everyone's warm. Dr. Pritchard said to watch for fever. Silas. She caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. I appreciate the concern. I do. But you're driving yourself crazy, and me along with you. The baby will come when the baby comes. All we can do is wait. But waiting was hard, especially as July dragged into August, and the baby showed no signs of arriving. Martha felt huge and uncomfortable and increasingly anxious, though she tried to hide it. The memory of her mother's death loomed larger as her due date approached, and she found herself unable to sleep, lying awake in the darkness, imagining all the ways things could go wrong. Silas, sensing her fear even when she didn't speak it, stayed close. He read to her in the evenings, not agricultural treatises anymore, but novels and poetry, stories that transported them both away from the hot, anxious present. He rubbed her aching back and swollen feet without being asked. He made her laugh when she wanted to cry. And when the contractions finally started on a sweltering August afternoon, he was the one who stayed calm while she panicked. "It's too early," she gasped, doubling over as pain seized her. "The baby's not supposed to come for another 2 weeks. Babies come when they're ready." Silas was already moving, years of managing crises in a one-room schoolhouse kicking in. "Sam, ride to town and fetch Dr. Pritchard. Tell him Martha's in labor. Go now." Samuel was out the door in seconds, and then it was just the two of them. Silas helped Martha to the bed, his hands gentle but sure, and began preparing, boiling water, gathering clean cloths, laying everything out with methodical precision. "I'm scared," Martha admitted as another contraction hit. "I know, so am I." Silas took her hand. "But we're going to get through this together. You're strong, Martha, stronger than anyone I know." "My mother is not you. You're healthy, the baby's healthy, and Dr. Pritchard will be here soon." He wiped sweat from her forehead. "And I'm right here. I'm not leaving, not for anything." The labor was long and hard and terrifying. Dr. Pritchard arrived 2 hours in, examined Martha, and pronounced everything progressing normally, though he warned it would likely be many more hours. The sun set and rose again while Martha labored, Silas never leaving her side, holding her hand through every contraction, wiping her face, encouraging her when she wanted to give up. "I can't do this," she sobbed at one point, exhausted beyond reason. "I can't." "Yes, you can." Silas's voice was firm, commanding in a way she'd rarely heard. "You've survived your parents' death, kept a farm running alone, made it through a Kansas winter. You can do this. You're the strongest person I know, and you can do this." Something in his certainty gave her strength when her own had failed. She bore down when Dr. Pritchard told her to, pushed when every muscle in her body screamed for rest, fought through pain that she'd never imagined possible. And then, as the sun rose on the second day of her labor, a baby's cry filled the small house. "It's a girl," Dr. Pritchard announced, holding up a tiny, red-faced creature. A healthy baby girl. Silas's hand tightened on Martha's, and when she looked at him through tears of exhaustion and relief, she saw his face was wet too. The doctor cleaned the baby and wrapped her in cloth, then placed her in Martha's arms. She was perfect, tiny and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably be gray-green like her father's. Martha stared at her daughter, overwhelmed by a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Silas reached out with one trembling finger and touched his daughter's tiny hand. She immediately grasped it, her grip surprisingly strong, and he made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She's beautiful," he breathed. "Martha, she's perfect." "She is." Martha looked up at him, this man who'd carried her through the hardest labor of her life, who'd refused to let her give up, who'd been exactly what she needed when she needed it. "Thank you for being here, for everything. I wouldn't have been anywhere else." He kissed her forehead gently. "What should we name her?" Martha thought of her mother, gone too soon, never having met this granddaughter. "Grace," she said. "Grace Elizabeth Crane." "Grace." Silas smiled through his tears. "It's perfect." Dr. Pritchard finished his examination, pronounced both mother and baby healthy, and left detailed instructions for their care. Samuel crept in once the doctor had gone, his eyes wide with wonder at the sight of his tiny niece. "She's so small," he marveled, touching her cheek with careful reverence. "Hi, Gracie. I'm your Uncle Sam." The baby yawned, unimpressed by her new title, and all three adults laughed with the slightly hysterical relief of having survived a crisis. That night, with Grace sleeping in the cradle Silas had spent weeks building, Martha lay in bed watching her husband watch their daughter. He'd pulled a chair up beside the cradle and was just staring at her with an expression of such wonder and love that it made Martha's chest ache. "You should sleep," she said softly. "I can't. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and this will all have been a dream." He looked over at Martha. "A daughter. We have a daughter." "We do." Martha smiled, bone-tired, but happier than she could remember being. You're going to be a wonderful father, Silas. I hope so. I don't know the first thing about raising a child. Neither did I when I had to raise Samuel. We'll figure it out together. Grace made a small noise in her sleep, and both parents immediately tensed, waiting to see if she'd wake. But she settled again, and they relaxed. Martha, Silas said quietly, still watching their daughter, when I answered your advertisement, when I got on that train to Kansas, I thought I was just looking for work and a fresh start. I never imagined this. A family, a home, someone to love who loves me back. A child. His voice caught. I thought men like me didn't get this kind of happiness. What kind of man is that? The weak kind, the sick kind, the kind who can't do what other men do. Martha reached out and took his hand, pulling him closer. Silas Crane, you're the strongest man I know. You survived the train ride here, survived Red Hollow's skepticism, survived pneumonia, survived a Kansas winter. You've turned this farm around with nothing but books and determination. You held me together through the scariest experience of my life, and you're going to raise that little girl to be smart and kind and strong. She squeezed his hand. That's not weakness. That's strength beyond what most men ever achieve. He was quiet for a long moment, then he leaned down and kissed her, gentle and tender and full of promise. I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving you right about me. You already have, Martha whispered. Outside, the Kansas night wrapped around the small farmhouse, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a promise of the storms that would come, the challenges they'd face. But inside, a family slept peacefully, bound together by love and determination and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. The man who'd been too thin to lift a bale had carried them all through to tomorrow, and tomorrow he'd do it again. The first weeks with Grace passed in a blur of sleepless nights and wonder. Martha recovered from the birth slowly but steadily, while Silas threw himself into fatherhood with the same intense focus he brought to everything else. He learned to change diapers with the precision of a scholar studying ancient texts, mastered the art of soothing a crying infant at 3 a.m, and could rock the cradle with one hand while reading agricultural reports with the other. You're a natural, Martha told him one morning, watching him feed Grace with a bottle of goat's milk, his movements confident and gentle. I'm terrified every moment that I'll do something wrong, he admitted, but his smile was soft as he gazed at their daughter. But she doesn't seem to hold it against me. Grace was thriving, growing plumper by the day, her eyes settling into that distinctive gray-green that marked her as her father's child. Samuel doted on her with an awkward teenage tenderness, and Martha often found him talking to his niece about horses and crops and the world she'd grow up in, as if the baby could understand every word. September arrived with cooler temperatures and harvest time. Silas's experimental diversification had paid off better than anyone expected. The corn was abundant, the wheat yield was strong, and even the small plot of sorghum had produced well. Word had spread through the county, and neighbors started stopping by more frequently, asking Silas for advice, treating him not with the skepticism of the previous year, but with genuine respect. John Henderson was among them, arriving one afternoon with his hat in his hands and a sheepish expression on his broad face. Crane, I owe you an apology. Silas looked up from the ledger where he was recording the harvest numbers. What for? For doubting you, for thinking you were too weak for this life, Henderson shook his head. For being a judgmental fool, basically. Your yields are 20% higher than mine, and you did it with less land and fewer resources. Whatever you're doing, it's working. It's just science and planning, Silas said, but Martha could see the pleasure in his expression. I'm happy to share what I've learned. I'd appreciate that. Henderson glanced toward the house where Martha sat on the porch with Grace. Your family's doing well, real well. Proves a man doesn't need to be built like an ox to prosper out here. After Henderson left, Silas returned to the porch, sitting beside Martha with a satisfied sigh. Did you hear that? I did. She shifted Grace to her other arm. How does it feel to be vindicated? Strange. Good, but strange. He reached out to stroke Grace's soft hair. I spent so long trying to prove I wasn't useless that I forgot to notice when I'd already proved it. You never were useless, Silas. Some of us always knew that. He looked at her with such love that it made her breath catch. Best decision I ever made was answering that advertisement. Second best, Martha corrected with a smile. The best was not getting back on that train when you saw what you were getting into. Never even considered it. Liar. I saw your face that first day. All right, maybe for about 5 minutes. His smile turned mischievous. But only 5 minutes. October brought a crisis that tested everything they'd built. A tornado, one of those terrible prairie monsters that could level a town in minutes, was spotted heading straight for Red Hollow. The sky turned that sickly green color that made experienced settlers drop everything and run for shelter, and the wind picked up with an ominous howl that spoke of destruction coming fast. Martha was in the house with Grace when she heard Silas shouting from outside. She ran to the door and saw it. A massive funnel cloud, black and roiling, bearing down on them from the northwest. Her blood went cold. The cellar! Silas was already running toward her, Samuel right behind him. Get Grace and get to the cellar now! Martha grabbed the baby and ran, Silas and Samuel right behind her. They'd reinforced the old root cellar last spring, added supports and a stronger door, but looking at the size of that tornado, Martha wondered if it would be enough. They made it inside just as the wind reached a fever pitch. Silas slammed the door shut and threw the bolt, then gathered Martha and Grace in his arms. Samuel huddled beside them in the darkness, and they could hear it coming, a sound like a freight train bearing down on them, so loud it felt like the world was ending. The cellar shook, dirt rained down from the ceiling, the door rattled in its frame, and Martha was certain it would tear free at any moment. She clutched Grace to her chest, the baby wailing in terror, and pressed her face against Silas's shoulder. It's all right, he was saying over and over, his voice barely audible over the roar. It's all right, we're all right, I've got you. The noise reached a crescendo that seemed impossible to survive, and then, suddenly, it began to fade. The roaring diminished to a howl, then to a whistle, then to nothing but the sound of rain and their own ragged breathing. They waited several minutes before Silas carefully opened the cellar door. What they saw made Martha's heart sink. The barn was gone. Just gone, as if it had never existed. The chicken coop was scattered across the field in 1,000 pieces. The fields themselves were torn up, crops flattened or ripped from the ground entirely. The house, their house, was partially collapsed, one entire wall caved in, the roof torn away on the north side. Oh, God, Martha breathed, still holding Grace tight. Oh, God, Silas, everything we worked for. We're alive. His voice was steady, though his face was pale. The house can be rebuilt, the barn can be rebuilt, the crops... He looked at the devastation and took a breath. The crops are a loss, but we still have what we harvested before the storm. We're alive, Martha. That's what matters. Samuel was staring at the wreckage, looking young and lost. What do we do now? Silas squared his thin shoulders and looked at the boy. We start over. We rebuild. That's what people do out here. They survive. And they rebuild. But the devastation was worse than they'd initially realized. As they picked through the wreckage over the next hours, they discovered that almost everything they hadn't harvested was destroyed. The winter stores in the barn, gone. The hay for the animals, scattered to the winds. Most of their tools, lost or damaged beyond repair. And the house, while still partially standing, was uninhabitable in its current state. They spent that first night in the cellar, all 4 of them huddled together for warmth and comfort. Grace slept fitfully, disturbed by the strange surroundings, and Martha fought back tears of despair. They'd worked so hard, come so far, and now, in a matter of minutes, it felt like they'd lost everything. We'll go to the Hendersons in the morning, Silas said quietly in the darkness. Ask if we can stay there while we figure out what to do. We can't impose like that, Martha protested. We can, and we will. That's what neighbors do. Henderson said it himself. People out here look after each other. He found her hand in the darkness and squeezed it. We'll figure this out, Martha. I promise. But when dawn came and they rode the surviving horse to the Henderson place, they found a scene of similar devastation. The tornado had cut a path straight through the heart of the county, destroying homes and barns and fields. The Hendersons had fared better than most. Their house still stood, but their barn was damaged and their own fields were in ruins. Lord have mercy, Mary Henderson said when she saw them. Come inside, all of you. You look half frozen. Over coffee and the biscuits Mary insisted on making despite her own crisis, the reality of their situation became clear. The tornado had devastated at least a dozen farms. Some families were talking about giving up, moving back east where life was less brutal. Others were trying to figure out how to rebuild with nothing. The town's organizing a relief effort, John Henderson said. Barn raising, house repairs, sharing resources. But it's going to be tight for everyone this winter. Real tight. Martha felt the weight of it pressing down on her. They had a baby now, a tiny life depending on them. How were they supposed to survive the winter with no barn, a ruined house, and depleted supplies? Silas was quiet on the ride back to their farm, his expression distant and thoughtful. When they reached what was left of their property, he helped Martha and Grace down from the horse, then stood looking at the devastation with his hands on his narrow hips. "What are you thinking?" Martha asked. "I'm thinking about a problem that needs solving." He pushed his glasses up his nose, that familiar gesture that meant his mind was working. "We can't rebuild everything before winter. That's just reality. But we don't need to rebuild everything. We need shelter, we need food storage, and we need a way to generate income to replace what we lost. Everything else is secondary." "That's still a lot," Samuel pointed out. "It is, but it's manageable if we're smart about it." Silas started walking around the property, examining the wreckage with a critical eye. "The cellar is intact. We can live there temporarily if we make some improvements. Better ventilation, a proper stove. Uncomfortable, but survivable. The house foundation is good, and one wall is still solid. We can build a temporary shelter attached to that wall, something simple that will get us through winter. Come spring, we rebuild properly." "What about storage?" Martha asked. "We lost the barn, and whatever we salvage needs to be protected. We build a small storage shed first, just big enough for essentials. Sam and I can do that in a week if we work hard." Silas was getting animated now, the way he did when he was solving a complex problem. "As for income, we still have what we harvested before the storm. It's not as much as we'd hoped, but it's something. And I can offer consulting services. Other farmers need help planning their recovery. We charge for my expertise." "People will pay for that?" Samuel sounded doubtful. "They already have been, informally. Now we make it official." Silas looked at Martha. "It won't be easy. This winter is going to be harder than last year. But we can survive it. I know we can." Martha looked at this thin man, this supposed weakling who everyone had assumed would break under the first real pressure. He'd just lost almost everything, and instead of despairing, he was calculating angles and solving problems. He was already fighting back. "All right," she said, "tell us what needs to be done." The next weeks were a blur of frantic activity. Silas drew up detailed plans for the temporary structures they needed, calculating materials down to the last board. Samuel and John Henderson worked together to salvage usable lumber from the wreckage, while Mary Henderson and Martha pooled their remaining supplies and figured out how to stretch them through winter. The whole community came together in a way Martha had never seen before. Families who'd lost everything helped families who'd lost less. Those with intact barns shared space. Food was redistributed based on need rather than ownership. And Silas, sitting at makeshift tables in partially destroyed homes, helped family after family plan their recovery, refusing payment from those who couldn't afford it and accepting modest fees from those who could. "You're making a name for yourself," Mary Henderson told him one afternoon. "People are calling you the smartest man in the county." "I'm just applying common sense in what I've read in books," Silas protested, but he looked pleased. "That's more than most men have." Mary smiled. "You know, when Martha first brought you home, I thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Now I think she might be the smartest woman in Kansas." By the time the first serious snow fell in late November, the Crane family had a functioning shelter. Not comfortable, not spacious, but weatherproof and warm. They'd built a small storage shed that held their salvaged supplies. They'd even managed to construct a temporary pen for the few animals that had survived. And Silas had established himself as the county's go-to advisor for agricultural planning, earning enough in fees to supplement their reduced harvest income. It wasn't prosperity, but it was survival, and on the frontier, survival was everything. Christmas came quietly again. They had less than the year before. Fewer gifts, simpler food, a shelter instead of a proper house. But Grace was there, now 4 months old and starting to smile at her father's silly faces. Samuel had grown another inch and was talking about staying on the farm instead of looking for work in town. and Martha and Silas had each other, stronger together than either had ever been alone. This time last year, I'd just survived pneumonia, Silas said on Christmas Eve, holding Grace while Martha stirred stew over their small stove. I remember thinking I'd proved something by not dying, that surviving the illness meant I was strong enough for this life. You did prove something, Martha said. No, I proved the wrong thing. Surviving pneumonia just meant I was lucky and stubborn. Surviving this, he gestured to their temporary shelter, to the rough conditions, to everything they'd lost and rebuilt. This proved something different. That strength isn't about what you can lift or how long you can work. It's about what you do when everything falls apart. It's about getting up and trying again when you have every reason to quit. Martha left the stew and sat beside him, taking his free hand. You want to know when I knew for certain I'd made the right choice marrying you? When? When the tornado hit. When everything was falling apart around us. You didn't panic. You thought. You planned. You found solutions. You were exactly what we needed in that moment. Not strong arms to lift rubble, but a steady mind to guide us through chaos. She squeezed his hand. That's your strength, Silas. You carry us through the storms that matter most. He kissed her then, gentle and tender, Grace squirming between them in sleepy protest. And Samuel, watching from his corner, smiled to himself, finally understanding what his sister had seen all along. Winter was hard, harder than the previous year in many ways. The temporary shelter was cramped and cold, and there were days when supplies ran dangerously low. But they made it through day by day, supporting each other through the difficulties. Silas caught a bad cold in January that terrified Martha, memories of his pneumonia making every cough sound like a death knell. But he recovered quickly this time, his body perhaps hardened by the previous year's trials, and was back to work within a week. Samuel turned 16 and was now taller than Silas by a full head, broad-shouldered and capable. But instead of the resentment that might have festered, there was respect between them. Samuel deferred to Silas's judgment on planning and strategy, while Silas relied on Samuel's strength and stamina for physical work. They'd become a true team, each appreciating what the other brought. February brought a letter that changed everything. It was from the Kansas Agricultural College in Manhattan, addressed to Silas Crane. Martha watched her husband read it, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to joy. "What is it?" she asked. "They want me to teach." He looked up, his eyes bright behind his glasses. "Someone at the college heard about my work helping families recover from the tornado. They're offering me a position as an instructor in agricultural science and management. They say," his voice caught, "they say I'm exactly the kind of practical innovator they're looking for." "Silas, that's wonderful." Martha felt a surge of pride, followed immediately by a stab of concern. "But Manhattan is 100 miles away. I know." He set down the letter, his expression conflicted. It would mean leaving the farm, moving the family, starting over somewhere new. Samuel had been listening from across the room. "Would they pay well?" "Very well, better than we could ever make farming alone." Silas looked between them. "But this is our home. This land. We fought for it, bled for it. I can't just walk away from that." Martha thought about the temporary shelter they were living in, the constant struggle to make ends meet, the brutal cycle of planting and praying and hoping the weather cooperated. She thought about Grace growing up in this harsh environment, about Samuel having opportunities beyond just working himself to death on a marginal farm. And she thought about Silas, brilliant and innovative, stuck in a life that didn't fully use his gifts. "I think you should take it," she said quietly. Both Silas and Samuel stared at her. "But the farm," Silas started. "The farm will always be here. Land doesn't go anywhere." Martha sat down beside him. "But this opportunity, this chance for you to do what you're actually best at, that might not come again. You've spent a year and a half proving you could survive on a farm, Silas. Maybe it's time to stop proving things and start actually living." "What would we do with this place?" Samuel asked. "We could lease it," Silas said slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Or sell it to someone who wants to farm it properly. Use the money to establish ourselves in Manhattan, maybe buy a house there." "I could come with you," Samuel added. "Go to school at the college. Actually finish my education." The possibilities hung in the air between them, tantalizing and terrifying in equal measure. It would mean leaving everything they'd built, all the relationships they'd forged in Red Hollow. But it would also mean security, opportunity, a life that didn't require quite so much raw survival. "Are you sure?" Silas asked Martha. "This is your family's land. Your parents worked this farm and nearly killed themselves doing it," Martha said honestly. "I love this land, Silas, but I love you more. I love our daughter more. I love the idea of a life where we're not always one bad season away from disaster." She took his hand. "My parents wanted me to be happy. I think they'd understand." The decision, once made, brought a kind of relief Martha hadn't expected. They put the farm up for sale and were surprised when John Henderson made an offer within a week. "I'm expanding," he explained, "and I want to use your land to try some of those crop rotation methods Silas has been preaching about. Seems only fitting that the land should keep benefiting from his ideas even after you're gone." They sold the farm for a fair price, enough to buy a modest house in Manhattan and have something left over for emergencies. The Hendersons threw them a goodbye party, and Martha was amazed to see how many people showed up. Families they'd helped, neighbors they'd worked with, even people who'd doubted Silas at the beginning but had come to respect him. "You changed things here," Tom Bridger said, shaking Silas's hand with genuine warmth. "Gave people new ways of thinking about farming. That's a real legacy." "I just read books and applied what I learned," Silas said, but he was smiling. "That's more than most men ever do." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "You take care of our Martha and that baby, and you," he pointed at Samuel, "you make something of yourself at that college. Make your sister proud." "I will, sir." They left Red Hollow on a bright May morning, the wagon loaded with their possessions, which still wasn't much, even after 18 months of marriage. Grace, now 9 months old, sat in Martha's lap, fascinated by the moving landscape. Samuel drove the wagon and Silas sat beside Martha, his hand in hers. As they crested the hill that would take them out of sight of the farm, Martha looked back one last time. She could see the rebuilt house, still temporary but serviceable. The fields Henderson was already preparing for planting, the land that had been her family's for a generation. "Regrets?" Silas asked softly. Martha thought about it honestly. "Some," she admitted, "but more hope than regrets. Much more." Manhattan was a revelation. After Red Hollow's dusty simplicity, the college town felt almost cosmopolitan. Their new house was small but had actual walls, real windows, a proper roof. There was a school for Samuel, shops within walking distance, neighbors close enough to hear but not so close they were in your business. And Silas thrived in ways Martha had never imagined possible. At the college, surrounded by other educators and students hungry for knowledge, he blossomed. His classes on agricultural science and practical farm management were immediately popular, and within months he was being asked to write articles for farming journals, to consult with agricultural departments across the state. "You were right," he told Martha one evening after a particularly successful lecture. "I was so focused on proving I could farm that I never stopped to think about whether I should farm. This, teaching, researching, helping people from a position of knowledge rather than just survival, this is what I was meant to do." "I knew it all along," Martha said with a smile. "You just needed to figure it out for yourself." Samuel enrolled at the college and discovered a passion for engineering. He still helped with practical demonstrations in Silas's classes, but his future was taking a different shape than either of them had imagined. Watching him grow and learn, Martha felt a pride that went beyond anything she'd felt on the farm. Grace took her first steps in their Manhattan house, celebrated her first birthday with a cake from an actual bakery, and grew into a bright, curious toddler who had her father's eyes and her mother's determination. And Martha, freed from the constant grinding work of farm survival, discovered talents she'd never had time to explore. She started a small business preserving foods for other families, using the skills her mother had taught her, but applying them in a new context. The extra income was welcome, but more than that, it gave her a sense of purpose beyond just keeping everyone alive. 2 years after leaving Red Hollow, they received a letter from Mary Henderson with news that made them all smile. The Hendersons had had their best harvest ever using Silas's crop rotation methods, and John Henderson had been elected to the county agricultural board specifically to help spread those methods to other farms. Your ideas are transforming how people farm around here, Mary wrote. John says to tell you that you were right about everything, and he'll never doubt a man in glasses again. High praise from John Henderson, Silas said with a laugh. You earned it, Martha told him. You earned all of this. But it was 3 years after leaving Red Hollow that the moment came that crystallized everything for Martha. The moment when she truly understood what strength meant and why Silas Crane, thin and frail and unable to lift a bale, had been exactly the husband she needed. It was late spring, and Martha was pregnant again, 5 months along and showing. They were at a college picnic, watching Grace chase butterflies with other faculty children, when one of Silas's colleagues approached with his wife. Professor Crane, the man said, and Martha still thrilled to hear Silas called Professor. My wife was just asking how you manage being in your condition and handling the demands of teaching and family. It took Martha a moment to realize the woman was talking about Silas, not her pregnancy. The woman was looking at Silas with something like pity, noting his thin frame and slight build. Before Martha could respond with the sharp defense that was already forming, Silas smiled, that gentle, self-assured smile he'd developed over the years. I manage the same way everyone manages, Mrs. Porter. I focus on what I can do rather than what I can't. I use my mind when others use their muscles. I ask for help when I need it and offer help where I'm able. And I married a woman strong enough for both of us when necessary. He glanced at Martha with such love that it made her chest tight. Turns out there are many ways to be strong. Mine is just less obvious than most. The woman looked embarrassed, but her husband was nodding thoughtfully. That's quite wise, Professor. I imagine your students benefit greatly from that perspective. After they'd moved on, Martha took Silas's hand. That was perfectly said. I meant every word. He squeezed her hand. I used to think I needed to prove my strength by meeting everyone else's definition of it. Took me a long time to realize I could just define it myself. When did you realize that? When you told me I was strong enough. When you chose to believe in the strength I had rather than mourning the strength I didn't. He pulled her closer. You saw me, Martha. Really saw me when everyone else just saw what I wasn't. That's a gift I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for. Martha watched Grace playing in the spring sunshine, thought about the child growing inside her, looked at Samuel across the lawn deep in conversation with other students, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. I was so scared that day at the train station, she admitted. When you stepped off that train and you were so thin, so obviously not what I'd expected, I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life. And now? Now I know it was the best decision I ever made. You couldn't lift a bale, Silas, but you carried me through pneumonia and childbirth and a tornado and poverty and doubt. You carried Samuel from angry teenager to young man with a future. You carried us from surviving to thriving. She placed his hand on her belly where their second child grew. You've carried us through life, and that's worth more than all the bales in Kansas. Silas's eyes were bright behind his glasses. I love you, Martha Crane, more than words can say. I love you too, my mail-order husband who was too thin to lift a bale, but strong enough to carry me through everything that mattered. They stood there together in the spring sunshine, watching their daughter play, and feeling the future unfold before them full of promise and possibility. Silas would continue teaching and writing, helping hundreds of farmers improve their yields and their lives. Samuel would graduate with honors and become an engineer, building bridges and buildings across the growing state. Grace would grow up knowing her father was respected and loved, would never doubt that strength came in many forms. And Martha would continue building the life she and Silas had created together. Not the life she'd imagined when she'd placed that advertisement, but something better, something truer, something that proved beyond any doubt that the strongest foundations were built not on muscle, but on love and determination and the stubborn refusal to quit. Years later, when Grace was grown and asking about how her parents met, Martha would tell the story of the thin man who stepped off the train in Red Hollow, looking like the wind could break him. She'd tell about the doubts and the struggles, the pneumonia and the tornado, all the times it seemed like everyone's dire predictions would come true. And then she'd tell about how that thin man had proved them all wrong, Not by becoming physically stronger, though he had grown more robust over the years, but by showing that strength was never just about muscle. It was about character, about persistence, about showing up every day and doing what needed to be done, even when it was hard, even when everyone doubted you, even when you doubted yourself. Your father couldn't lift a bale of hay when I met him, Martha would say, smiling at the memory. But he lifted me every day since. He lifted all of us, and that's a strength that nothing can measure. And Silas, older now with gray threading through his hair, but still thin, still wearing glasses that slipped down his nose, would smile that gentle smile and take her hand. I was just waiting for the right thing to carry, he'd say. Turns out love is lighter than hay anyway. They'd laugh together then, these two people who'd found each other through a newspaper advertisement in desperation, who'd built a life against all odds, who'd proved that strength came in forms most people never recognized until they needed it most. The Kansas sun would set over their Manhattan home, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, and inside the house there would be warmth and laughter and love. Outside the window, the wheat fields would wave in the evening breeze, and somewhere far off, thunder would rumble. But it would just be the promise of rain, not a threat. Just weather, just life. And in that house, in that moment, Martha Crane would hold her husband's hand and know with absolute certainty that she'd been right all along. The man who'd been too thin to lift a bale had been exactly strong enough to carry them all through life. And that was more than enough. That was everything. That was love.